He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself. He just picked up his bag, nodded once, and walked out of the boardroom like a man who already knew the fight wasn't worth having. Not here, not with these people. 32 years old, a single father, and he'd just been fired for saving lives. The executive across the table smiled. The CEO at the head of the room said nothing. But something in that silence, in the way Nolan Mercer left without a single word, would crack open the next 6 weeks like a fault line running straight through the foundation of everything. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The alarm on Nolan Mercer's phone went off at 5:15, same as every morning, and he silenced it before it could wake Lily. He lay there for a minute in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the apartment he'd been renting for 3 years, the one with the water stain above the closet that looked like a running dog, the one where the radiator clicked and hissed through the whole winter like it had opinions about the temperature. He told himself when he moved in that it was temporary. 3 years later, the water stain was still there, the radiator still complained, and he'd stopped thinking about temporary. He got up. The kitchen light buzzed when he flicked it on. One of the fluorescent tubes was going. He'd been meaning to replace it for 2 weeks, kept forgetting to grab one when he was at the hardware store. He put the coffee on, leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, and listened to the building come awake around him. Footsteps from the unit above, a door closing somewhere down the hall, the distant sound of a city that never actually slept, just got quieter for a few hours. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a sunflower, was a drawing Lily had made at school, a man and a girl standing in front of a house. The man was roughly 3 times taller than the house, which Nolan thought was fair because 7-year-olds drew what they felt, not what they saw. The girl in the picture had a yellow triangle dress and hair that went in all directions. The man had a wrench in one hand. She'd drawn him with a wrench. He'd stared at that picture so many times he'd stopped seeing it, the way you stop hearing traffic if you live near a highway long enough. But some mornings, it hit differently. This was one of those mornings. He made his coffee, drank it standing up because sitting down felt like giving in to how tired he was, and then he went to wake his daughter. But Lily Mercer woke up the way she always did, all at once, like a switch being flipped. No groggy half-consciousness, no slow crawl back to the surface. 1 second she was asleep, and the next she was sitting up in bed asking if they had any of the blueberry waffles left. "I think we have one," Nolan said. "One's not enough." "It's what we got." She thought about this with the seriousness of a person reviewing a contract, then said, "Fine, but I want peanut butter on it." "Peanut butter goes on the waffle, not on top of the syrup." "Why?" "Because peanut butter and syrup together is too much." "That doesn't make sense. More good things should make a better thing." He stood in her doorway looking at her, this 7-year-old with her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and absolutely nothing of Nolan's patience. And he felt the familiar pressure behind his sternum that he'd learned to live with the way you learn to live with bad knees or a trick shoulder. Not pain exactly, something heavier than that, something that didn't have a clean word. "Peanut butter on the side," he said. "For dipping." "Okay," Lily said, and scrambled out of bed. He dropped her at school by 7:40, stood at the gate until she disappeared through the main doors without looking back. She never looked back, hadn't since she was 5, which alternately made him proud and unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain, and then he drove to work. The Hargrove Logistics Distribution Center was the 3rd largest facility in the Northeast Corridor, which was the kind of thing the company put in press releases and on the wall plaques in the lobby. To the people who worked there, it was a building, specifically a very large building with 4 loading docks, a refrigerated storage wing, 2 machine rooms, an administrative floor that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and anxiety, and approximately 1,100 feet of ventilation ductwork that Nolan Mercer knew better than he knew his own apartment. He'd been there 4 years. Started as a contracted maintenance tech, came on full-time after 18 months, got his certification in industrial safety systems 2 years in. He wasn't management. He wasn't on the administrative floor. He worked in the building, in its walls, in its guts, and its mechanical rooms, and he was good at it. The other techs called him Nolan, Most of the floor workers called him by his last name. The shift supervisor, a heavy-set man named Curtis, who'd been at Hargrove for 11 years and had the energy of someone who'd made peace with all of his choices, called him the quiet one, which Nolan thought was accurate enough. He wasn't unfriendly, he just didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. He pulled into the employee lot, grabbed his bag, and badged in through the side entrance at 7:58. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that by 10:30, he would be sitting in a boardroom on the 4th floor, being fired. The morning started the way most of them did. There were 3 work orders waiting: a pressure issue in the east ventilation line, a belt replacement on loading dock 2's conveyor, and a recurring thermostat fault in the cold storage unit that had been flagged and resolved 4 times in the past 2 months without anyone actually fixing the underlying relay problem. Nolan took the thermostat job first because it annoyed him. Not personally, but professionally, the way it annoyed him when something broken kept getting called fixed by people who didn't understand what fixed meant. He was in the cold storage relay panel at 8:40 when his phone buzzed. Text from Curtis. "They want you up at 10:30, admin floor, conference room B." He looked at the message for a second, then went back to the relay panel. Conference rooms on the admin floor weren't unusual. He'd been up there twice before, once for a safety compliance review, and once because a water line in the ceiling above the finance department had developed a slow drip. Neither time had felt significant. He filed the 10:30 in the back of his mind the way he filed most things and finished the relay job. By 9:15, the thermostat fault was actually fixed. At 10:25, he rode the elevator to the 4th floor, still in his work clothes. Gray uniform shirt with the Hargrove logo on the chest, steel-toed boots, the leather belt with the tool holders on it that Lily had once declared looked like a cowboy but for pipes. He hadn't thought to change. He didn't know he should have. The admin floor was a different world from the building's lower levels. Carpet instead of sealed concrete. Track lighting instead of industrial fluorescence. It smelled like people who spent their days in chairs instead of on their feet, which wasn't a smell exactly, but more like an absence of the smells Nolan was used to. Grease, refrigerant, the electric hot scent of relay boards and running machinery. He found conference room B without difficulty. 3 people were already inside when he opened the door. He recognized 2 of them. The first was Derek Holt, the company's director of operations. 45 years old, silver-templed, the kind of man who wore his authority like a well-tailored suit, and had, in Nolan's limited experience, the pleasant surface manner of someone who had spent 20 years deciding how much of himself to let other people see. Nolan had interacted with him maybe 6 times in 4 years, mostly in the context of safety reviews or facility audits. He was never rude. He was never warm either. The second was a woman from HR named Patricia, who Nolan knew by name and nothing else. She'd been at his onboarding and he'd signed papers in front of her. The third person he didn't recognize at first. She was sitting at the far end of the table, slightly apart from the others, and she wasn't looking at him when he came in. She was looking at something on the table in front of her. A folder, he thought, though she'd closed it by the time he registered what it was. 30 years old, maybe, dark blazer, no jewelry he could see, hair pulled back. She had the kind of face that didn't announce itself. You could be in a room with her for 10 minutes before you noticed how sharply she was paying attention to everything in it. He sat down when Patricia indicated a chair across from Holt. "Mr. Mercer," Holt said. "Thanks for coming up." "Sure," Nolan said. He looked around the room. The woman at the end of the table still hadn't said anything. He noticed that she was watching him the way he sometimes watched relay boards when he was trying to figure out where the fault actually was. Not at the obvious point, but at what the obvious point connected to. He didn't know who she was yet. He was about to find out. "I'll be direct," Holt said, "because I think that's the most respectful way to handle this." Nolan nodded once. "On the night of October 14th, you made the unilateral decision to shut down operations in the Facility B processing wing. Is that correct?" "Yes," Nolan said, "without authorization from your shift supervisor." "Curtis wasn't answering his phone. I left a voicemail." The shutdown resulted in approximately $300,000 in delayed orders and spoiled product. Holt slid a paper across the table. "That's the preliminary damage estimate. The actual number may be higher. Nolan looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. There's also the matter of your access to Facility B's systems, Holt continued. The shutdown was performed using a Level 3 override code. You're authorized for Level 2. I had a Level 3 code. You were issued a Level 2. The code I used was in the system. If it worked, it was in the system. Holt's expression didn't change. The question of how you obtained a Level 3 code is part of what we're reviewing. Patricia cleared her throat quietly. She had a folder of her own open in front of her, and she was looking at it rather than at Nolan. Mr. Mercer, given the severity of the operational impact and the circumstances of the unauthorized system access, Hargrove Logistics has made the decision to terminate your employment, effective today. Nolan sat with that for a moment. The woman at the end of the table shifted slightly. Just her weight, just the way she was sitting. He glanced at her, and for 1 second she looked directly back at him, and he thought, though he couldn't have said why, that she was the most alert person in the room. Mr. Mercer, Patricia said carefully, do you have anything you'd like to say? He thought about October 14th. He thought about the smell that had hit him when he'd come into the Facility B processing wing at 11:20 p.m. on a routine check. The particular chemical edge of ammonia in a space that wasn't supposed to have any ammonia in it. He thought about the reading on his meter, which had been double what it should have been, and climbing. He thought about the 12 workers still on shift in that wing. He thought about what high-concentration ammonia exposure does to the human respiratory system, and he thought about Lily at home asleep, and he thought about what kind of man he wanted to be when the moment came that asked him what kind of man he was. He thought about all of that in roughly 4 seconds. Then he said, "No." He pushed back from the table, picked up his bag, and stood. Patricia said something about the HR process and personal belongings, and his final paycheck being mailed. He nodded. He shook nobody's hand. He walked to the door, opened it, and left. 8. Vivian Hale watched him go. She'd been watching him since he'd walked in, a habit she'd had since she was a child, the impulse to observe people carefully before deciding what she thought about them, which her mother had called unsettling and her first business professor had called a gift. She was 30 years old and she'd been CEO of Hargrove Logistics for 11 months, inheriting the position from her father, who'd stepped back for health reasons. And she had spent most of those 11 months learning that she knew far less about running a company of this scale than she'd believed she did. She'd sat in on today's meeting because Derek Holt had flagged it as a significant HR matter with financial implications, and she'd thought she should be there. She hadn't planned to say anything, and she hadn't said anything. She'd watched. She'd watched the maintenance technician sit down across from Derek Holt and listen to everything that was said to him. She'd watched him look at the damage estimate and not pick it up. She'd watched him answer questions in short sentences that didn't elaborate or apologize. And she'd watched him, when given the chance to defend himself, choose not to. That last part was the one she couldn't shake. In 11 months of sitting across from people in high-stakes conversations, she had seen people lie, deflect, minimize, attack, cry, bargain, and go very quiet in the specific way that meant they were calculating. She had not, until today, seen someone choose silence the way Nolan Mercer had chosen it, not from defeat, not from guilt, but from something else. Something that looked, from where she was sitting, like a man who had decided that the people in this room weren't worth the truth. She didn't like what that implied. After he left, Patricia closed her folder with the brisk efficiency of someone crossing something off a list. Holt relaxed visibly. She noticed that, too, the particular way his shoulders dropped when the door clicked shut. "That was handled well," he said. Vivian said. "Minimal disruption. No threats, no lawyers mentioned." "He didn't ask about severance," Patricia said. "He'll get what he's owed." Holt gathered his papers. "Simple situation, honestly. Unauthorized access, significant financial damage. The decision was correct." Vivian picked up the file she'd had in front of her, the one she'd been given yesterday by Holt's office, labeled Facility B Incident, October 14th. She'd read through it twice before the meeting. It was thorough. It was well organized. Everything in it supported a clear narrative. An employee had exceeded his authorization, made a costly unilateral decision, and needed to be let go. "Why did he shut it down?" she asked. Holt looked at her. "I'm sorry?" "What was his stated reason for the shutdown? Is there a report?" A beat. Brief, but she caught it. There was a maintenance log. He noted a potential ventilation issue. It was reviewed and found to be non-critical. Reviewed by who? Our facilities compliance team. When? 2 days after the incident. And the original reading? His meter reading? Whatever triggered his decision? That data isn't in the system, Holt said, which is consistent with improper use of override protocols. Those records are sometimes incomplete. Vivian looked at him. She had the distinct impression that she was being managed, which was a feeling she'd gotten used to recognizing in the past 11 months, even when she hadn't always acted on it. People managed her constantly and with great skill, and she'd made the mistake early on of assuming that being aware of it was the same as not being susceptible to it. "All right," she said. She stood, tucked the file under her arm. "Thanks for including me." "Of course," Holt said warmly. She left the conference room and took the elevator back to her own floor, and she stood at her office window looking down at the employee parking lot. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe the maintenance technician's car leaving. Maybe something that would make the feeling in her chest less specific. She looked at the file again. Reviewed and found to be non-critical. She thought about the way Nolan Mercer had sat in that room. Calm, attentive, giving nothing away. And the way he'd said no when asked if he had anything to add. And the way he'd walked out like the decision had already been made long before he'd arrived. She thought about all of it, and then she set the file down on her desk and didn't open it again. Not yet. The drive home was 40 minutes in afternoon traffic. Nolan took it slow, which wasn't something he normally did. He was usually a precise driver, efficient, the kind of person who knew which lane moved faster and used it. But today he stayed in the middle lane and let people pass him and didn't care. He called his sister on the way. She was 3 years older than him, lived in Baltimore, worked in hospital administration, and was the only person he regularly talked to about things that actually mattered. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," she said. "What's wrong?" "Why do you assume something's wrong?" "Because you're calling at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. You don't call during work hours." "I got fired." Silence for a second. "Are you serious?" "This morning, about 4 hours ago." "Nolan." More silence. "What happened?" "It's complicated." "Of course it is." He heard her shift, the background noise of her office getting quieter. "Are you driving?" "Yeah." "Okay, talk." He told her the shortened version, the October 14th shutdown, the 12 workers, the ammonia readings, the meeting this morning. He kept his voice level because he was driving and because he was not the kind of person who lost his composure on the phone with his sister in traffic, though right now the temptation was there. "Did you tell them?" she asked when he was done. "About the ammonia? In the meeting?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it didn't matter," he said. They knew. Holt knew. Whatever I said in that room, the decision was already made. If I start talking about what actually happened, all I'm doing is handing them a record of exactly what I know. Right now, they don't know what I know. His sister was quiet for a moment. "That's either very smart or very stupid. I know. Do you have any of the readings, the data from your equipment?" "I logged everything that night. The readings, the timeline, the meter data. I've got copies." "You kept copies." "I keep copies of everything. 4 years of maintenance logs." Another pause. "Okay," she said. "Okay, what do you need right now?" "I need to pick up Lily at 3:30. I mean, after that." "After that, I don't know yet." She made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. "Call me tonight, after she's asleep." "I will. And Nolan, whatever you're sitting on, be careful, okay? I know you." "What does that mean?" "It means I know how you get when you decide something needs to be dealt with correctly. Don't do anything alone." He pulled into his apartment complex and sat in the car for a minute after he'd parked. "I'm just going to pick up my kid," he said. "I'm serious." "I know you are." He grabbed his bag off the passenger seat. "I'll call tonight." He hung up. He sat there another minute looking at the building's front entrance, thinking about October 14th, and about Holt's shoulders dropping when the door closed, and about whether any of this was going to stay as quiet as the people with something to lose needed it to. He picked Lily up at 3:35, 5 minutes late, because the parking lot at the school was an obstacle course of other parents, and he got stuck behind an SUV that couldn't decide whether it was turning left or right. Lily was standing with her teacher near the gate, holding her backpack with both hands in front of her like she was carrying something fragile. When she saw him, her face did the thing it always did. Not a big smile, just a settling, like she'd been slightly wound up all day, and he was the switch that unwound it. He felt it in the center of his chest. "You're late," she said. 5 minutes. Ms. Chen was worried. Ms. Chen knew you'd be fine. Lily fell into step beside him, and he put his hand on the top of her head for exactly 2 seconds before she ducked away from it because she was 7 and too old for that, apparently. "Did you have a good day?" he asked. "We did a unit about bridges," she said. "Did you know suspension bridges work because of triangles?" "I did know that." "How did you know that?" "Because of my job." She thought about this. "Are you building bridges at your job?" "Not exactly, but the same ideas." "What ideas?" "Tension and compression. Everything that holds together because of tension and compression." She considered this with the focused expression she got when she was actually interested in something. "What's tension?" "It's a force that pulls something apart." "That sounds bad." "It's not, if you design for it. The whole point of a suspension bridge is that the tension is controlled. You know where the pulling is going to happen, so you build for it." Lily nodded slowly. "Like when you're holding the bag and you know it's going to be heavy." "Exactly like that. So if you know something's going to be hard, you can hold it better." He looked down at her walking next to him, 7 years old. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly." She spent the rest of the walk to the car telling him about bridges, and he listened to every word, and for those few minutes the weight of the morning was still there. But it was contained, like something he knew how to carry. Yeah. He made dinner, pasta with jarred sauce because he hadn't gotten to the grocery store and there was nothing else to work with. Lily ate it without complaint. She'd gone through a phase at 6 where she'd decided she didn't like pasta, but that had passed the way most things passed with her, without discussion or explanation, as if her opinions had their own internal revision schedule. He told her about the job while she was eating. He'd thought about waiting, thought about whether 7 was old enough for this conversation, and then decided that dishonesty by omission was still dishonesty, and he'd made himself a rule early on that he didn't lie to his daughter about things that affected her. "I'm not going to be at that job anymore," he said. Lily looked up from her pasta. "Why not?" "I had a disagreement with the people who run the company." "What kind of disagreement?" "The kind where I did something that needed to be done and they didn't want me to do it." She thought about this with the pasta twirled on her fork. "Did you do the right thing?" "Yeah," he said. "I did." "Then it's their fault," she said, and went back to eating. He looked at her for a moment. The certainty of children. The specific kind of trust that came from a 7-year-old who believed, based on all available evidence in her experience, that her father was not the kind of person who did the wrong thing. He wasn't sure what he'd done to deserve that trust, but he was absolutely sure he couldn't afford to lose it. "I'm going to find another job," he said. "It might take a little while. We're going to be fine." "I know," Lily said. "Can I have more pasta?" "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'll get you more." At 9 o'clock, with Lily asleep and the apartment quiet, Nolan sat at the kitchen table with his personal laptop and his work binder, the physical one he kept at home, the backup. And he went through his logs from October 14th. He'd made the entry at 11:27 p.m., detected elevated ammonia concentration in Facility B processing wing. Reading, 28 parts per million and climbing. OSHA. Short-term exposure limit, 35 parts per million. Decision made to shut down operations in wing, evacuate shift workers, lock ventilation until source identified. He'd found the source at 12:04 a.m. A failed seal on one of the refrigeration units in the cold storage corridor adjacent to the processing wing. The same refrigeration unit with the recurring thermostat fault that had been logged and resolved multiple times. The ammonia had been leaking into the ventilation ductwork. At the rate it was climbing when he'd found it, he'd calculated that it would have hit the 35 parts per million short-term exposure limit somewhere between 12:15 and 12:30. The 12 workers on shift had been in the processing wing until 11:35. If he hadn't found it, they'd have been there until midnight. He sat with that for a while. Then he went to the section of his log from the following day, October 15th, where he'd noted in careful, neutral language that he'd been approached by a supervisor he didn't report to directly, a man named Gary in facilities management, who had told him that the incident was being reviewed internally and that in the meantime he should not discuss the shutdown with coworkers or make any external reports. "The company will handle the communication," Gary had said. "You understand how these things can get misconstrued." Nolan had said he understood, which wasn't the same as agreeing. 2 weeks later, he'd started getting flagged for performance reviews. Work orders being questioned, access protocols being scrutinized. Small things, individually, but patterns were patterns. He'd recognized it for what it was, and he'd started keeping copies of everything. He closed the binder. He thought about the woman in the conference room, the one who'd been watching him. She hadn't introduced herself. She hadn't said a single word the entire time. But she'd been the most present person in that room, and the look she'd given him when he'd said no, when he'd chosen not to speak, had been the look of someone trying to solve something. He didn't know who she was. He closed his laptop and went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while, thinking about bridges, about tension and compression, about how things held together when you knew where the force was going to come from, about the specific quality of a man who knew something was pulling at him and had decided to find out what it was connected to before it took him apart. He slept eventually. Not well, but enough. Vivian Hale worked until past midnight. This wasn't unusual. She'd kept long hours since she'd taken the position, partially from necessity and partially because the job had the quality of a tide that never quite went out, always leaving new debris on the shore. But tonight she wasn't working on anything that was on her schedule. Tonight she had the Facility B file open on her second monitor, and she was doing what she was very careful, in professional settings, never to let anyone see her do, going backward, not forward from the conclusion, backward from it. The conclusion was that Nolan Mercer had made an unauthorized decision that cost the company money and needed to be terminated. That was the conclusion. Backward from the conclusion, the question started: who reviewed the incident? What exactly did the compliance review find? Where was the original data from Nolan's equipment that night? Why was the only documentation of the ventilation issue his maintenance log, with no independent corroboration from anyone else on shift? She was a logistics CEO, not an investigator. She knew that. She also knew that in the past 11 months she had been handed conclusions more times than she'd been handed processes, and that there was a specific category of things she'd found herself agreeing to because the documentation supporting them was thorough, and the people presenting them were calm, and she was, in quiet moments that she didn't love about herself, sometimes more comfortable accepting a well-packaged answer than asking the next question. The maintenance technician had said no. He'd looked her in the eye for exactly 1 second, the length of time it took her to look back, and then he'd gotten up and left without a word. Something about that 1 second kept finding its way back. She reached for her phone. She had her assistant's number, her general counsel's number, Derek Holt's number. She had the number of her father, who still called every few weeks to ask how things were going and to tell her she was doing fine even when she wasn't. She had the number of the friend who'd known her since college and who could, on a good night over wine, make her laugh in a way that cleared out whatever the week had deposited. She didn't call any of them. She pulled up the internal directory instead and found the records for the facilities and maintenance department and looked for the work order history associated with Facility B. She started at October 14th, then she went further back. By midnight 30, she'd found 3 prior work orders flagging the same refrigeration unit in the Facility B cold storage corridor. All 3 had been marked resolved. 2 of them had been closed out within 12 hours of being opened, which was fast, faster than standard resolution time for equipment of that complexity. She looked at who had signed off on each closure. All 3 were signed by the same name: Gary Tennant, Facilities Management. She wrote that down on the pad she kept on her desk. Actual paper, which her EA thought was endearing and which Vivian found useful for thinking in ways that digital tools weren't built for. She wrote Gary Tennant's name, and under it she wrote Derek Holt, and under that she wrote October 14th, and under that she wrote, "Why is the source data missing?" Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her office and thought about the fact that in 4 years of employment, Nolan Mercer had received exactly one disciplinary note, a flag about tardiness from his first 6 months that had been resolved without further incident, and had otherwise been consistently marked as reliable, thorough, and technically strong by every direct supervisor he'd had. Until October 15th, the day after he'd shut down the wing, after which the flags had started. "Okay," she said quietly to no one. She picked up her pen. She turned to a new page. She started from the beginning. The name Gary Tennant appeared 11 times in the Facility B maintenance records going back 18 months. Vivian found this at 1:17 in the morning, somewhere between her third cup of coffee and the point where the numbers on her screen started to blur at the edges if she looked at them too long. She'd been working backward through the work order archive methodically, the way she did most things, not fast but without stopping. And the pattern had emerged the way patterns usually did, not dramatically but incrementally, the way a shape in fog resolves itself if you keep walking toward it. 11 entries. 3 of them were the refrigeration unit closures she'd already flagged. The other 8 were scattered across different systems in Facility B: conveyor calibration, ventilation filter replacement, electrical panel checks, all routine on the surface, all signed off within timelines that were technically within compliance, but consistently on the faster end of what was realistic for the work described. Not impossible, just fast. The kind of fast that meant either Gary Tennant's crew was exceptionally efficient or the work wasn't being inspected as thoroughly as the paperwork suggested. She printed the relevant pages, which she knew was inefficient and that her assistant would have opinions about, and she laid them across the conference table on the other side of her office and stood looking at them with her arms crossed and her coffee going cold on the edge of the table. It wasn't proof of anything. She knew that. Paperwork anomalies weren't crimes, fast closures weren't necessarily cover-ups. She was a CEO who'd stayed up past 1 in the morning reading maintenance logs because a maintenance technician's face in a termination meeting had bothered her, and she was aware that this was, by any reasonable standard, not the most grounded basis for an investigation. But she kept coming back to the thing that wasn't there. Nolan Mercer's meter data, his equipment readings from the night of October 14th. In a shutdown of that significance, $300,000 in operational impact, a full wing evacuation, there should have been a chain of documentation. His initial readings, the readings he would have taken after finding the source, the ventilation diagnostic data, the refrigeration unit's fault log for that night, all of it should have been in the system. None of it was. She'd checked twice. Either it had never been uploaded, which contradicted everything in his 4-year record of thorough documentation, or it had been removed after the fact. Those were the 2 options. She didn't love either of them. She thought about calling her general counsel, a careful man named Raymond Chu, who was very good at risk management and very practiced at the particular tone of voice that meant, "What you're doing is legally interesting and I need you to stop." She thought about calling her father, who would say something measured and experienced and probably useful, and who would also carry the worry of it in a way she hated burdening him with. She didn't call either of them. Instead, she went to her desk and opened a blank document and typed a list of 7 questions, and next to each question she wrote what she'd need to answer it. It took her 20 minutes. When she was done, she read through it twice, changed 2 words, and saved it under a file name that would mean nothing to anyone who happened to see it in her directory. Then she went home. She had a board meeting at 8. She slept for 4 hours, which wasn't enough, but it was what she had. 3 days after he was fired, Nolan got an envelope. It was mixed in with the regular mail. A cable bill, a coupon mailer, a card from his mother that he hadn't opened yet, and it had no return address, which he noticed before he noticed anything else about it. Just his name and address, printed on a label, and a local postmark from 2 days ago. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment before he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No signature, no letterhead, no identifying information of any kind. Just 11 words, printed in plain black type in a standard font that would be impossible to trace. "Your daughter takes the bus home alone on Tuesdays and Thursdays." He read it once. Then he read it again. He set it down on the table and he stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, he was aware of the refrigerator humming and the sound of a car outside, and the specific quality of silence in the apartment when Lily was at school and he was alone in it. Then he picked up his phone and called his sister. She answered on the first ring. "Hey, I was going to call you tonight. Someone knows Lily's schedule," he said, a silence that had a different quality from her usual pauses. "What?" "I got an envelope this morning, no return address. It says she takes the bus home on Tuesdays and Thursdays." He picked the paper back up, though he didn't know why. He wasn't going to read it again. "She does. She started taking the bus 2 weeks ago. Most people don't know that." "Nolan," his sister's voice had flattened in the way it did when she was controlling something. "Is that a threat?" "It's information presented in a threatening way, which is the same thing. You need to call the police." "And tell them what? Someone mailed me a sentence?" "Someone is watching your daughter." "I know that." He sat down at the table. "I know that. I'm calling you first because I needed someone to know, and because I need to think." "There's nothing to think about. This is connected to what happened at work." "Obviously." "Then they're trying to scare you into staying quiet." "They're doing a decent job." "What are you going to do?" He looked at the piece of paper on the table. "First thing, I'm changing her schedule. She doesn't take the bus anymore until this is done. I'll arrange something with the school, or Mrs. Park downstairs can pick her up. She's offered before." "And then?" "And then I need to think about what I have and what they're willing to do to keep me from using it." His sister was quiet for a moment. "They fired you, Nolan. Now they're threatening your kid. That's not a small thing." "I know it's not. So don't handle it alone, please. You have a habit of, I know what my habits are. Deciding that the right way to deal with something is to deal with it yourself, quietly, and then not saying anything until it's either resolved or it's gotten worse. And I'm telling you that this is the situation where that habit is going to get you hurt." He was quiet. She was right, and he knew she was right, which didn't make it easier to say out loud. "I'm going to make some calls," he said finally. "Who?" "I'll let you know when I know more." He looked at the envelope again, the label with his name on it. Someone had printed this, addressed this, mailed this. Someone who knew his address, knew his daughter's routine, and had wanted him to know that they knew. "Can you come up this weekend? I'd feel better if you were here." A pause. "Yeah," she said. "I can do that. I'll drive up Saturday morning." "Okay." "Nolan, be careful." "I'll call you tonight." He hung up and sat there for a while. Then he went to his file cabinet, found the accordion folder where he kept all his maintenance logs, and he sat back down at the kitchen table and started going through them systematically, because whatever he was going to do next, the thing he needed to understand first was exactly what he had. Vivian's assistant, a 26-year-old named Marcus, who was frighteningly organized and had never once, in 8 months of working for her, asked a question he should have already known the answer to, came into her office at 10:15 on Thursday morning and set a coffee on her desk with the expression of someone who had something to report. "The records request came back," he said. She looked up from the quarterly review she was pretending to be focused on. "Which one?" "Facility B, ventilation and refrigeration system logs, October through August, going back 18 months. "That was fast." I pushed it through as a standard compliance audit pull. He set a USB drive on her desk next to the coffee. "Everything's on there, but..." He paused in the specific way he did when there was a but that required delivery time. "The ventilation fault log for October 14th has a gap." "What kind of gap?" "About 6 hours, from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. The file exists, the timestamps are there, but the data entries for that window are just gone. Not corrupted, not missing. The entries were deleted, and whoever deleted them didn't clean up the metadata, so you can see the ghost of where they were." Vivian looked at him. "You can see that?" "My brother is in IT forensics. He told me what to look for." He paused. I was just doing a standard pull." "Marcus." She kept her voice even. "You did exactly the right thing. Don't explain it to death." He nodded once, composed again. "Also, I checked the sign-in logs for the record system. 3 people accessed that log file in the 2 weeks after October 14th. He laid a printed sheet on her desk. "Their access credentials are listed." She picked it up. She looked at the 3 names. One of them was Gary Tennant, One was a records administrator named Susan Pollard, who she didn't know, and one was Derek Holt. She set the sheet down. "Marcus," she said carefully, "this conversation didn't happen yet. Nothing you've just told me has been formally reported. Do you understand what I'm asking?" He considered for exactly 3 seconds. "You want to understand what you're looking at before anyone else knows you're looking at it." "Yes." "That's reasonable," he said. "Is it? If the alternative is flagging something incomplete to people who might be connected to it, then yes." He pulled the USB drive back, then stopped. "Unless you want me to." "No, leave it." She put her hand on it. "Thank you." After he left, she sat with the printed sheet and the USB drive and the coffee, and she thought about Derek Holt's shoulders dropping when the conference room door had closed behind Nolan Mercer. The particular quality of that relief. She'd logged it and filed it, and now she was looking at it from a different angle, and from this angle it had a different shape. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to a number she'd stored 3 weeks ago and hadn't used yet, a former colleague from her second job out of college, a woman named Dana, who now worked in corporate forensic accounting. They'd stayed in loose contact the way you stayed in contact with people you respected, but didn't have regular reason to talk to. She typed, "Are you in a place where you could talk for 15 minutes? Something came up." Dana responded in 4 minutes. "Call me whenever. Flagging you as personal so it won't route." Vivian closed her office door, which she almost never did, and dialed. Dana Ferris asked good questions. That had always been the thing about her. She didn't explain, she probed, and the probing was never aggressive, just persistent in the way that water was persistent, finding whatever wasn't sealed. "Walk me through the financial records you have access to," she said, after Vivian had given her the compressed version of what she'd found. "Standard executive access. I can pull departmental P&Ls, budget allocations, vendor contracts over $50,000. Look at your vendor contracts for Facility B, specifically anything related to refrigeration or HVAC maintenance, over the last 2 years. I can do that. And look at whether any of those vendors have been through a competitive bid process or whether they've been on a renewal cycle that's bypassed normal procurement. What am I looking for?" "Relationships," Dana said simply. "Vendors that stay without scrutiny tend to stay for reasons. Sometimes those reasons are legitimate, sometimes they're not." She paused. "You said the safety work orders were closed fast? Faster than standard resolution time. Were the vendors who did the work the same vendors every time?" Vivian hadn't looked at that. "I don't know yet. That's where I'd start." Dana's voice was measured, thinking out loud. If someone is systematically closing out safety work without proper inspection, they're probably doing it with a vendor who isn't going to ask questions. And a vendor who isn't asking questions is usually a vendor who's being paid not to. Vivian sat with that for a moment. "Dana, if this is what it looks like, it might not be. This could be sloppiness, institutional laziness. Companies this size develop corners they stop looking at." Pause. "But the deleted data is the thing I can't explain away. Sloppiness doesn't delete data. That's deliberate." "Yeah. So if you're asking me whether you should keep pulling on this thread, yes, but quietly. And Vivian." Dana's voice shifted slightly. "If there's a regulatory angle here, OSHA, workplace safety. You're going to want to get out in front of it rather than have it find you." "I know. Because the other thing that deleted data means is that someone already knew what it showed. She already knew that. She'd known it since 1 a.m. when she'd first noticed the gap in the records. But hearing it from someone else, plainly and without softening, settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 days. "I'll call you when I have the vendor records," she said. "I'll be around." She had the vendor records by 4 that afternoon, and she sat with them until 6. And by 6 she had found what Dana had told her to look for. 5 vendors with contracts tied to Facility B maintenance and safety systems. 3 of them had gone through normal procurement, competitive bid, annual review, documented renewal. 2 had not. The 2 that had not were both tied to refrigeration and HVAC work, and both had been on a quiet auto-renewal cycle for 26 months without a single competitive review. Combined annual value, just under $400,000. Neither company had a significant web presence. One had an address that, when she mapped it, was a mail forwarding service in a strip mall. She stared at that for a while. She made herself eat something. She'd forgotten about lunch entirely and realized at 6:15 that her body had been running on coffee and adrenaline for the better part of a day, which was fine, but not sustainable. And then she went back to her desk and started building a document. Not a formal report, a personal working document, a timeline. What she knew, what she could prove, what she needed to verify, and what she still didn't understand. The thing she still didn't understand was Nolan Mercer's silence. She kept coming back to it. Not because she needed him. She had records, she had data, she had the deleted entries in the fault log and the ghost of their metadata. She didn't need him to make the picture, but the picture she was building had a gap in the middle, which was the specific sequence of events on the night of October 14th, and the only person who'd been there for all of it was the man who'd chosen not to speak. She thought about finding him. She thought about what she'd say. "I'm the CEO you watched fire you last week. I'd like to know what happened." She couldn't call the HR department for his contact information. Not for this, not without it getting back to someone she didn't want to flag yet. She sat thinking about that for a few minutes, and then she did what she should have done immediately. She pulled the original onboarding file for Nolan Mercer, which she had legitimate authority to access, and she found his emergency contact number, and under it, his address. She looked at it. She wrote it on her pad. She didn't call him that night. She went home and ate an actual meal and sat on her couch with the documents she'd printed and worked through them again, and she thought about the difference between what she was sure of and what she suspected and what she still needed. And she thought about Derek Holt's face in the conference room and what it meant that he was on the list of people who'd accessed those deleted records. She thought about what she was going to do about that. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet. Nolan's sister arrived Saturday morning with a bag, a box of pastries, and the brisk energy she always had when she was worried about something and channeling it into action. Her name was Renata, and she was 3 years older than Nolan and 4 inches shorter, and had, as long as he could remember, treated every problem as a logistical challenge to be organized. She hugged Lily first, then Nolan, and then she set the pastries on the counter and said, "Show me the letter." He showed her. She read it twice, same as he had, held it by the edges, set it down. "You didn't touch it much," she asked. "Just the edges." "Good." She looked at it again. "You need to report this to the police, Nolan. I know you think it won't accomplish anything, but there needs to be a record." "I know." "Today." "This afternoon. I was going to take Lily to the park this morning." Renata looked at him with the expression she'd been perfecting for 35 years. "You're taking your daughter to the park the week after you get a threatening letter about her." "I'm taking my daughter to the park because she asked me yesterday and I said yes, and I'm not going to stop doing normal things because someone sent me a piece of paper. That's what they want." A pause. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Act like the thing that's scaring you isn't scaring you." Lily came into the kitchen in her pajamas and saw the pastries, and her face did the thing it did. "Are those from the place with the almond ones?" "They are," Renata said, and the conversation shifted the way it always did when Lily entered a room, because children had that gravitational effect. They pulled focus, redirected energy, made adults briefly become the best version of themselves just by being present. They ate pastries. Lily told Renata about bridges and suspension physics with the authority of someone who had recently discovered something important and wanted to make sure everyone knew it. Nolan made more coffee and listened and watched his daughter talk with her hands and thought about the letter on the table and who had sent it and what they thought he was going to do next. He filed a police report that afternoon. The officer was professional and not unkind and very clearly explained, without saying so explicitly, that an unsigned letter with no explicit threat was difficult to act on but would be documented. He took the letter in an evidence bag and gave Nolan a case number. Nolan thanked him and left. That night, after Lily was asleep and Renata was reading on the couch, he sat at the kitchen table with his maintenance log binder and a legal pad and tried to think through all of it the way he would think through a mechanical problem. Not from the breakdown forward, but from the design backward. What was supposed to happen? What actually happened? Where were the points where those two things diverged? What was supposed to happen was that Facility B got maintained safely, workers got protected, safety protocols got followed. What actually happened was that a refrigeration unit had been logged as repaired 3 times without being repaired. A seal had failed. Ammonia had leaked into the ventilation system. He'd found it and stopped it, and then someone had deleted the data, pressured him to be quiet, manufactured a case for his termination, and was now threatening his daughter. The divergence points were the fake closures, the deleted data, and the termination meeting. He thought about who benefited from those things, and the answer wasn't complicated. Someone had been paying vendors to close out safety work without doing it, which meant someone had been pocketing the difference, which meant the fake repairs were a financial operation dressed up as a safety failure. The safety failure was the feature, not the bug. He looked at what he had, his maintenance logs going back 4 years, his own data from the night of October 14th, including the meter readings and the timestamps. The text Gary Tennant had sent him 3 days after the incident, the one on his personal phone, not on the work system, but that said, the investigation is being handled internally. It's in your best interest not to make additional reports. Nolan had screenshotted it immediately and saved it to 3 different places. He had 1 text message, his own logs, and a deleted data record he didn't have direct access to. It wasn't enough on its own. He chewed the end of his pen and looked at the ceiling and thought about the woman in the conference room, the CEO. He'd looked her up after the meeting. Vivian Hale, 30 years old, took over from her father 11 months ago. Previously worked in supply chain operations at 2 other companies before coming to Hargrove. No record of anything like this on her watch. No major scandals in her background. He thought about the way she'd been watching him. Not with the managed attention that Holt had, the practiced professional look of a man who was deciding how convincing he needed to be, but with something more unsettled. Like she'd come into the room expecting one thing and was leaving with another. He'd made a decision in that conference room not to speak, and it had been the right decision in the sense that it protected him. It kept his cards where only he could see them, but it also meant that the person who might have been an ally was still operating from the story Holt had handed her. He didn't know if she was an ally. He didn't know if she was compromised. He didn't know what she knew or what she'd done with the past week. He wrote her name on the legal pad and looked at it. Then he wrote a question next to it. Is she looking? He didn't have an answer yet. She called him on Monday. He was in the apartment mid-morning, working through job listings on his laptop with the focused and slightly depressing energy of someone who knew they needed to be doing this and wasn't fully present for it. The call came from a number he didn't recognize, a local exchange, and he almost let it go to voicemail. He answered on the 4th ring. Mr. Mercer. A pause. This is Vivian Hale. I know who you are, he said. A beat on her end. Okay. Another pause, brief, like she was resetting. I'd like to meet with you. In person, not at the Hargrove offices, somewhere you'd choose. I want to talk about what happened. He was quiet for a moment. Why? He said. Because I think what I was told doesn't match what actually occurred. And I think you know what actually occurred. I signed termination papers. I know. Meeting with me could create liability for the company. I'm aware of that. I'm not calling as the company. I'm calling as the person who was in that room. He looked across the kitchen at the sunflower magnet on the refrigerator, at Lily's drawing of the man with the wrench. He thought about the letter with no return address. He thought about his sister's voice. Don't do this alone. There are things I need to say to you before we meet, he said. Okay. I don't know whose side you're on. I don't know what you've already been told or what you've already shared with the people who arranged that meeting. That's fair. If this is an attempt to find out what I have so that someone can get ahead of it, it's not. Her voice was direct without being sharp. I understand why you'd consider that, but I've been going through the records for a week, and I have questions that nobody in my building can answer without me flagging that I'm asking them. You're the only person I know of who was actually there. He thought about that. The Park Street Diner, he said, across from the transit hub, tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Sit somewhere you can see the door. All right. Come alone. Yes. And Ms. Hale. He kept his voice even. I need you to understand something before tomorrow. Someone sent a letter to my home address with information about my daughter's school schedule after I was fired. So whatever this is, it's past the point where I'm going to be careful about who I say the wrong thing to. I'll hear you out, but I'm done being managed. The silence on her end lasted 4 seconds. I didn't know about that, she said quietly. I know you didn't, he said. But someone in your building does. He hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, and then he put it on the table and went back to his laptop and the job listings. Because Lily had school in 2 hours, and he needed to pick her up at 3 and make dinner and help with homework and do everything that needed to be done on the surface of his life, while the thing underneath it built pressure, the way ammonia built pressure in a failing seal. He knew about pressure. He knew what happened when the system pretended it wasn't there. He'd seen what that cost. Vivian sat in her car in the parking structure beneath her building for a few minutes after the call ended. She hadn't told anyone she was making it. Not Marcus, not Dana, not Raymond Chu. She'd pulled the number from the HR file on her personal phone, from a photo she'd taken of the paper, and she'd called on her lunch break while sitting in her car, which was either prudent or paranoid, and she couldn't fully decide which. Someone in your building does. She sat with that. The letter to his home. His daughter's schedule. That wasn't financial maneuvering. That was the kind of pressure you applied to someone you were afraid of, someone who had something. She thought about what he had. A maintenance technician who'd been at Hargrove for 4 years, who logged everything, who'd been on shift the night of a ventilation incident that someone had subsequently deleted from the records. A man who'd had 3 weeks of sudden performance flags after an incident he wasn't supposed to talk about, followed by a termination meeting that had been prepared with unusual thoroughness for a mid-level employee. Whatever he was carrying, someone had decided he was dangerous enough to frighten. She started her car. She had 3 afternoon meetings, a budget review, a vendor call, and a check-in with Derek Holt about the Q4 operational projections, which she was now going to sit through while knowing what she knew about him and trying not to look like she knew it. She was going to have to be better at this than she currently was. She drove back to the surface, into the gray November light, and she thought about the Park Street Diner and 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and she thought about the kind of conversation that didn't have a script and didn't have a safe outcome, and that she was going to go into anyway, because the alternative was sitting in the conference room where she'd watched a man be fired for saving 12 people and deciding that was fine. The meeting with Holt that afternoon lasted 40 minutes. He was his usual self, smooth, well-prepared, good with numbers, the sort of executive who made you feel like everything was in hand. She asked her questions and listened to his answers and said the right things at the right times and gave absolutely nothing away. She was getting better at it than she'd thought. On the drive home that night, she thought about what Nolan Mercer had said. I'm done being managed. She thought about what that meant, said from a position he was in. Fired, threatened, a single father with no institutional backing, no legal team, no corporate access, done being managed. She thought about what kind of person decided that, and what kind of person it took to mean it. The Park Street Diner smelled like coffee and fried eggs, and the particular warmth of a room that had been open since 6 in the morning. Nolan got there at 7:52, 8 minutes early, because he was always early when something mattered. He took a booth near the back with a clear sight line to the door, ordered coffee he didn't need, and waited. She walked in at exactly 8 o'clock. He recognized her immediately. Not from the conference room, though that was where he'd first seen her, but from the quality of attention she carried with her, the way she scanned the room before committing to walking into it. She was dressed differently than she'd been in the boardroom. Dark coat, plain sweater, no visible corporate armor. She spotted him, came over without hesitating, and sat down across from him like she'd been rehearsing the approach and had decided the only way through it was straight. Thank you for meeting me, she said. You want coffee, he said. Yes, please. He flagged the server. They sat in the brief silence of 2 people who didn't know each other, deciding where to begin. She looked tired, he noticed, not dramatically, just the specific tiredness of someone who'd been burning hours on something that wasn't on her schedule. The coffee came. She wrapped both hands around the mug. I'm going to tell you what I've found, she said, and then I want you to tell me what I'm missing. All right. She laid it out. She was concise, more concise than he'd expected, given that she was a CEO who'd presumably spent the last 11 months in rooms full of people who used many words to say small things. The deleted ventilation logs, the metadata ghosts, the two vendors with no competitive bid history and one address that was a mail forwarding service. Derek Holt's name on the access list for the deleted file. The auto-renewal contract's worth $400,000 a year. When she was done, she picked up her coffee and waited. Nolan looked at her for a moment. He was trying to read her the way he read equipment, not by what it was doing on the surface, but by what the surface connected to. What he got from Vivian Hale, sitting across from him in a diner booth at 8 in the morning with her hands around a coffee mug, was someone who was genuinely unsettled. Not performing unsettled, actually in it. "You got further than I expected," he said. "I had a week." Most people with a week would have filed something officially and let the process handle it. "The process is what I'm worried about," she said. "If Holt is connected to those records deletions, I don't know who else in the building is connected to him. I don't know who the process reports to." That was the right answer. He didn't say so, but he noted it. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, not the threatening one, a different one, and set it on the table between them. "That's a copy," he said. "My maintenance logs from October 14th. Meter readings, timestamps, the sequence of what I found and when I found it. The source of the leak, the unit it came from, the readings before and after the shutdown." She looked at the envelope but didn't pick it up yet. "The refrigeration unit that failed," he said, "had been logged for repair 3 times in 4 months. I wasn't the tech assigned to it. It went through Gary Tennett's team. Every time it came back closed with a resolution note. I checked the last 2 closures myself because the thermostat fault kept recurring, which it shouldn't have if the underlying seal issue had actually been addressed. It hadn't been. Whoever was signing off on those repairs wasn't doing the repairs." "Tennant," she said. "Tennant had a crew of 3. 2 of them were contracted through one of your ghost vendors." He watched her absorb that. "I didn't know that when it happened. I figured it out afterward, when I started pulling the work order history." "How did you get access to the work order history after your termination?" "I kept copies," he said simply. 4 years of logs. It's a habit." She picked up the envelope now, held it, didn't open it yet. "Why didn't you say any of this in the termination meeting?" He looked at her steadily. "Because Derek Holt was running that meeting, and because you were sitting at the end of the table and I didn't know who you were yet." A pause. "You didn't know I was the CEO?" "I knew you were somebody. I didn't know whose side you were on." She didn't bristle at that, which he respected. She just nodded, once, like someone accepting a fair point. "And now?" "Now I'm sitting in a diner talking to you, which I wouldn't be doing if I decided you were on the wrong side." She set the envelope down on the table between them. "The letter to your home," she said. "Do you know who sent it?" "No, but the number of people who knew Lily's bus schedule is small. I'd been at the company 4 years. Most people knew I had a daughter. Not many knew she'd started taking the bus 6 weeks ago." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "Whoever sent it has access to the kind of background detail that takes either surveillance or a source close to me." "That concerns me significantly more than the financial fraud," she said quietly. "It should." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her working through something. "I have a forensic accountant I trust. She's not connected to Hargrove. She's already seen some of what I pulled from the vendor records." She paused. "And I have someone in IT forensics, indirectly, who confirmed the metadata on the deleted log. If I bring them in more formally, I need to be certain that whatever you have matches what the records show." "It matches," he said. "That's why someone deleted the records." She nodded. "There's one more thing I need to ask you." She looked at him directly. "The Level 3 override code. Holt said you weren't authorized for Level 3, but the code worked, which means it was in the system. Where did you get it?" Nolan was quiet for a moment. This was the piece he'd been sitting on, the one he'd decided he would or wouldn't share depending on how this conversation went. "Curtis," he said, "my shift supervisor. He gave me an upgraded code 6 months ago when we were dealing with a refrigerant pressure issue that required Level 3 access and he couldn't get down to the building in time. He said he'd update it in the system. Apparently he never did. He paused. Curtis is clean. He didn't know what was coming. Has anyone talked to Curtis since your termination? I don't know. I haven't contacted him. Didn't want to put him in a position. She absorbed that. That's either very considerate or very isolating. Both, he said. They sat there another 40 minutes. It wasn't a smooth conversation. There were pauses, moments where one of them was clearly recalibrating, one stretch near the end where Vivian said something she immediately qualified and then stopped qualifying and just let sit. She wasn't a person who smoothed everything over, which he appreciated. She was a person trying to figure out what was true, which was harder and more uncomfortable and much more useful. At 9:05, she said, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm not asking because of liability or because of what it means for the company. I'm asking because I need to understand what was actually at stake on October 14th. Okay. If you hadn't shut the wing down, if you hadn't found it when you did, what happens? He thought about how to answer that. He'd run those numbers in his head enough times that he didn't need to think long. The reading when I found it was 28 parts per million. It was climbing at roughly 1.5 parts per million every 20 minutes, based on what I measured over the first 40 minutes of investigation. OSHA's short-term exposure limit is 35 parts per million for a 15-minute window. At that rate, the wing would have hit exposure threshold somewhere between 12:15 and 12:30 a.m. The workers were there until midnight. If they stayed on normal shift schedule, yes, 12 workers. In an enclosed processing space with limited ventilation, by design because it's adjacent to cold storage, at 35 parts per million for 15 minutes, you're looking at respiratory irritation, potential throat and lung damage in anyone with underlying sensitivity. Above 40 parts per million over sustained exposure, it gets significantly worse. And the thing about ammonia leaks in enclosed spaces is that by the time people smell it strongly enough to react, they've often already been exposed beyond what's safe. She was very still. Nobody died, he said, because I found it. That's the whole story. She picked up her coffee. It had to be cold by now. She drank some of it anyway. The compliance review 2 days later said the issue was non-critical. The compliance review was done by Gary Tennett's team, he said, after I'd already shut down the source and cleared the area. So by then the reading was back to normal and the seal had been temporarily patched. There was nothing to find if you didn't know where to look and weren't looking to find it. She set the mug down with a small, controlled movement. Okay, she said. Okay. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be honest with you about something. Go ahead. I sat in that conference room and I didn't stop it. I was there, I had authority, and I watched it happen because the documentation Holt gave me was thorough, and I didn't ask enough questions fast enough. She wasn't delivering this as a performance of remorse. Her voice was flat, factual. I'm not telling you that because I need you to forgive it. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that I know it. He looked at her for a moment. What are you going to do about it? He said. Everything I can, she said, starting today. He believed her. Not because she'd said it perfectly or because there was anything impressive about the delivery, but because she was sitting in a diner at 9 in the morning and she looked like someone who hadn't slept well in a week, which was what it looked like when something was actually weighing on you rather than when you were managing the appearance of something weighing on you. There's one more thing I haven't told you, he said. She waited. 12 days after the shutdown, before any of the performance flags started, I got a text from Gary Tennett on my personal number. Not a work channel, my personal phone. He pulled up the screenshot on his phone and slid it across the table. He told me the investigation was being handled internally and that it was in my best interest not to make external reports. I saved it. She looked at the screenshot. Read it, read it again. He texted this to your personal number, which means someone gave him my personal number. That's not in the company directory. She set the phone down on the table carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady. I need copies of everything you have, the logs, the meter data, the timestamps, this text. She paused. Can you get me those? I have them. Not emailed, Not through any channel connected to Hargrove systems. I know, he said. I'll get you a drive. He dropped off the drive that afternoon at an address she gave him. Not the company building, a business center 3 miles away where she said she had a leased meeting room she used for outside consultations. He left it at the front desk in a sealed envelope with her name on it, and he drove home. And he picked up Lily from the school's aftercare program because the bus arrangement had been quietly suspended. And he made dinner, and he helped Lily with a worksheet about fractions. And he sat with the low-grade vibration of a man who has done the thing and is now waiting for the consequences of having done it. Renata called at 9. How'd it go? Better than I expected. You trust her? He thought about it honestly. I trust that she's looking for the same thing I'm looking for. Whether that makes her trustworthy? I don't know yet. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not. Bob. Vivian spent the next 6 days in a state of controlled urgency that she was careful, moment to moment, not to let show. She brought Dana in more formally, not officially, not on a Hargrove retainer, just a phone consultation that didn't run through the company's legal billing. She gave Dana copies of the vendor records, the metadata report, and Nolan's maintenance logs. She didn't tell Dana about the threatening letter to his home because she wasn't sure what to do with that information yet, and sharing it felt like it would change the shape of what they were doing before she understood the shape well enough. Dana spent 2 days with the material and called back on a Thursday evening. The vendor situation is worse than you thought, she said. Vivian had been waiting for this call in her car in the parking structure again, which had apparently become her location for conversations she couldn't have at her desk. Tell me, the 2 ghost vendors. I traced the registration on both of them. They're shell companies. Different names, different stated services, but the same registered agent and the same formation date 14 months ago. Same person set them up. Almost certainly. And the formation date is interesting. It's about 6 weeks after Derek Holt transferred into his current role from the Eastern Regional Office. Vivian sat with that. There's more, Dana said. The payment records I can see from the vendor contracts. The amounts being paid out don't match what maintenance work of that type and volume would typically cost. They're running about 60 to 70% above market rate. So someone's billing the company at inflated rates through shell vendors and pocketing the difference. That's what it looks like. Conservatively, over 26 months, we're talking somewhere in the range of $200,000 extracted through the inflated contracts. A pause, which is significant, but the safety angle is the one that changes the category of what this is. This isn't just financial fraud. If workers were being put at risk because safety inspections were being faked to protect the scheme, that's a different set of charges entirely. How do I get this to the right people without tipping off anyone inside the building first? Dana was quiet for a moment. You're going to need to go outside the company's legal structure. Your general counsel has an obligation to the board, and the board has members who may be connected to this. You want outside counsel, someone who specifically handles regulatory whistleblower cases. And you want to make the approach to OSHA and the federal investigators simultaneously, so nothing has time to disappear. How long do I have before Holt figures out someone's looking? I don't know, but you've been pulling records for a week and a half, and he hasn't moved yet, which means either he doesn't know or he's watching and waiting to see how far you get. Neither option was comfortable. Can you help me find the outside counsel? I have 2 names, Dana said. I'll text them tonight. The security footage came from a place nobody had thought to look. It was Marcus who found it, technically, though he'd been following a thread Vivian had given him, a reference in one of Nolan's maintenance logs to a secondary camera mounted near the Facility B cold storage corridor, a unit that had been installed 18 months ago as part of a safety upgrade, and that wasn't part of the main security system. It ran on its own network, archived to a local drive rather than the central server. And because it wasn't in the central system, whoever had deleted the ventilation logs either hadn't known it existed or hadn't thought it mattered. Marcus found the archived drive reference in the original installation documentation. He didn't access it directly. He was careful about that, because he understood that what he was doing was operating in a gray space, and he didn't want to make it grayer. But he brought Vivian the installation records and the drive location, and she made a call to the outside counsel Dana had recommended. a woman named Sheila Torres, who specialized in exactly this kind of case, and who had, in their first 30-minute conversation, asked the three most important questions in exactly the right order. Sheila is the one who coordinated the retrieval of the footage. She did it through channels Vivian didn't fully understand but trusted, with a forensic IT specialist who could testify to the chain of custody. It took 2 days. When the footage came back, Vivian watched it alone in the leased meeting room at the business center, on a laptop that wasn't connected to anything, and she understood within the first 4 minutes why someone had wanted Nolan Mercer to stay quiet. The timestamp on the footage was October 14th, 11:18 p.m. The angle wasn't perfect. The camera was mounted high, capturing most of the cold storage corridor and part of the entry to the processing wing. But it was clear enough. At 11:18, a figure Vivian recognized as Gary Tennant entered the corridor from the maintenance access door. He went to the refrigeration unit at the far end. He did something to the unit's control panel. His body was partially blocking the camera's view, but his movements were deliberate and took less than 90 seconds. Then he left. At 11:24, the cold storage monitor on the wall, visible at the edge of the frame, showed a status light that had been green flipped to amber. At 11:26, Nolan Mercer entered the corridor from the main access. He had his meter with him. He was clearly doing a routine check, moving efficiently, the specific economy of motion of someone who knew this space well. Then he stopped. He checked his meter, checked it again, held it near the ventilation return. And Vivian watched his posture change, not dramatically, but in the specific way that a person's posture changed when a number on a screen told them something they didn't want it to tell them. He pulled out his radio, tried it again, got out his phone. At 11:31, he moved to the panel on the wall and began the shutdown sequence. At 11:35, she could see, through the partially open door to the processing wing, workers beginning to file out. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling of the rented meeting room. It was a standard drop ceiling, the kind that was in every generic commercial space in every city, unremarkable in every possible way. And she stared at it for a moment and thought about 12 people walking out of a building and going home to their families on October 14th because a maintenance technician had been doing a routine check and taken a reading seriously. And then she thought about Derek Holt's name on the access list for the deleted ventilation log. And she thought about Gary Tennant entering that corridor 6 minutes before Nolan did, doing something deliberate to the unit's control panel. She picked up her phone and called Sheila Torres. "I've seen the footage," she said. "And?" Sheila's voice was careful. "Tennant went to that unit before Nolan found the leak. He accessed the control panel." A pause. "How long before?" 6 minutes. "You understand what that potentially means?" "Yes," Vivian said. "I understand exactly what that means." What it meant was that the ammonia leak might not have been an accident. What it meant was that someone might have deliberately triggered a safety failure and then needed it not to be found. What it meant was that when Nolan Mercer had done the exact right thing, he'd accidentally surfaced something far larger and far more deliberate than a neglected repair. "How do we move?" Vivian asked. "I've already made the preliminary contact with the OSHA regional office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. They've been waiting for the footage." Sheila's voice was steady, in the way that experienced professionals' voices were steady, not because nothing was wrong, but because she'd been in rooms where things were wrong before and knew what came next. "They'll want the full package: Nolan Mercer's logs, the metadata forensics, the vendor records Dana compiled, the footage. We submit everything simultaneously." "When?" "Monday morning," Sheila said. "Can you have everything ready?" "Yes," Vivian said. She looked at the laptop screen, still frozen on the last frame she'd been watching. "There's one more thing. The letter to Nolan's home. His daughter's schedule." "Yes, you need to include that. That's witness intimidation. It changes the criminal exposure significantly for whoever's connected to it." A pause. "Have you told him about the footage?" "Not yet." "Tell him," Sheila said. "He deserves to know what it shows." She called him that evening. He answered on the second ring. "We found security footage from a secondary camera in the Facility B corridor," she said. "October 14th. Silence for a moment on his end. It shows Tenet accessing the refrigeration unit 6 minutes before you got there, she said. And it shows your entire response, the readings, the shutdown, the evacuation, all of it. He was quiet for longer than she expected, long enough that she would have thought the call dropped if she couldn't hear him breathing. Okay, he said finally. His voice was level, but she could hear something underneath it that wasn't level, something under pressure and holding. Nolan. She hadn't used his first name before. It came out before she'd decided to use it. It shows everything. It shows what you did and why you did it and exactly how you did it. There's no version of this footage where what you did on October 14th is anything other than exactly what it was. Another silence. Shorter this time. My lawyers are submitting everything to federal investigators Monday morning, she said. OSHA, FBI Financial Crimes. Simultaneously, so nothing has time to move. What do you need from me before then? Nothing. You've already given us everything we need. He was quiet again. She heard something in the background. Small, light footsteps. Lily, she thought, asking about dinner or homework or something that had nothing to do with any of this. I have to go, he said. I know. Ms. Hale. A pause. Thank you. She sat in the business center parking lot after they hung up, in the dark and the cold, and she thought about what it meant to carry something for 3 weeks alone, fired, threatened, a 7-year-old at home who drew her father with a wrench, who believed that when he said he did the right thing, he had. She thought about what it cost a person to sit in a conference room where nobody was on their side and choose silence as the only thing they could fully control. She thought about the footage, about the moment his posture changed when the meter gave him the number he didn't want, about the 6 minutes between Gary Tenet leaving that corridor and Nolan entering it. She started the car. Monday was 4 days away. She didn't know what came after Monday, but she knew what came before it, and she knew what it had cost, and that felt like the kind of thing that needed to sit with her for a while before she let herself move past it. The weekend before the submission felt longer than it should have. Nolan spent most of Saturday doing the things that needed doing regardless of what was happening underneath them. Laundry, groceries, a leaking kitchen faucet that he'd been ignoring for 2 weeks because his mind had been elsewhere, and that he now fixed in 20 minutes with a wrench and a replacement washer from the hardware store down the block. Lily sat on the bathroom floor while he worked and asked questions about plumbing with the same systematic curiosity she applied to everything, and he answered them, and the faucet stopped dripping, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did. Renata had gone back to Baltimore on Sunday, which she'd felt guilty about. He could hear it in the way she hugged him at the door, that extra second she held on. He told her it was fine, that the worst of the waiting was almost over, and she'd looked at him with the expression that meant she knew he was managing her and was choosing to let it work. She called from the road 2 hours later just to say she'd arrived safely, which wasn't something she normally did, and he understood that the call was for him, not for her. Sunday night, he sat with Lily until she fell asleep, which he didn't usually do. She was 7 and had been falling asleep on her own for 2 years, but he sat in the chair by the window anyway, in the dark, listening to her breathe. He thought about October 14th. He thought about the footage Vivian had described, Tenet going to the unit, the deliberate movement, the 6 minutes. He'd known something was wrong from the beginning, known it in the specific way you knew things when you worked with systems long enough to understand what deliberate looked like versus what accidental looked like. But knowing and having footage were different categories of certainty entirely. He thought about Monday, about what happened after Monday, about whether the thing he'd been carrying for 3 weeks would finally move from his chest to somewhere it could be dealt with properly by people with the authority to deal with it. He didn't sleep well. He hadn't slept well in 3 weeks. At this point, it was just the texture of things. Monday morning, Sheila Torres submitted the full package at 9:17 a.m. Vivian knew the exact time because she was sitting in the leased meeting room at the business center when it happened, and Sheila had texted her a single word: submitted. She sat with her phone in her hand and looked at the word for a moment and felt something that wasn't quite relief. Too early for relief, too much still unresolved, but was adjacent to it. The specific feeling of a thing that had been held very carefully finally being set down in the right place. The package included Nolan's maintenance logs from October 14th with the meter readings and timestamps, The metadata forensics showing the deleted entries in the ventilation fault log, the vendor registration records Dana had compiled with the shell company analysis, the security footage from the Facility B corridor with the chain of custody documentation, the screenshot of Gary Tennett's text to Nolan's personal phone, the police report Nolan had filed about the threatening letter, and a 40-page summary document Sheila had assembled that laid out the timeline, the financial fraud analysis, and the safety violations in language that federal investigators could work with directly. It went to the OSHA regional office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit simultaneously, as planned. Sheila had also sent a preliminary notice to the State Labor Board. Vivian went back to the office at 10:30. She had a department head meeting at 11 that she'd considered canceling and then decided against, because canceling it would raise questions, and raising questions right now was not something she could afford. She sat through the meeting and answered questions about Q4 projections and listened to the head of logistics talk about capacity issues in the northern facilities. And she said the right things, and she looked at Derek Holt twice across the conference table, and he looked back at her with his usual composed professionalism, and she gave him nothing. She was getting good at this, which was not something she would have said about herself 2 weeks ago. The first contact from federal investigators came on Wednesday. Sheila called Vivian at 2 in the afternoon. OSHA wants to do a site inspection of Facility B on Friday. The FBI has reviewed the financial materials and they're opening a formal inquiry. They'll want to interview you separately, probably early next week. What about Nolan? They'll want his testimony. His logs are central to the timeline. I've already spoken with him. He has his own counsel now, someone I recommended. He knows what's coming. Is he okay? A slight pause on Sheila's end, the kind that meant the question had landed as something other than procedural. He's steady, she said. He's been steady this whole time. Vivian knew that. She'd seen it in the conference room 4 weeks ago, before she'd understood what she was seeing. What do I do about Holt in the meantime? Nothing that changes his routine. Don't confront him. Don't alter his access. Don't let anything in his environment change. The investigators need him where he is and operating normally for as long as possible. And Tennant? Same. Both of them need to believe nothing is coming until it's already there. This was the part Vivian found hardest. Sitting across from Derek Holt in meetings, answering his emails, responding to his operational updates with the normal cadence of professional exchange while knowing what she knew. She'd always been reasonably good at maintaining surfaces. Years of business had required it. But this was a different order of it. This was looking at someone across a table and understanding that they'd sent a threatening letter to a 7-year-old's home and still saying in a normal voice, "The Q4 numbers look reasonable. Let's revisit the northern capacity issue next week." She did it. She did it the way she'd done everything for the past 3 weeks. Not because it was easy, but because the alternative was worse. And the thing she was working toward mattered enough to justify the discomfort of the path to it. The OSHA inspection happened Friday morning. 2 inspectors arrived at Facility B at 8 a.m. with credentials and clipboards and the specific authority of people who did not need to ask permission to go where they were going. Vivian had been briefed on what they would find. What they found was documented in a report she received a summary of the following Tuesday. 17 outstanding safety deficiencies in Facility B alone, 7 of which were classified as serious under OSHA's severity scale. The refrigeration unit at the center of the October 14th incident showed evidence of a manipulated control interface, something the inspectors described in technical language that Sheila translated for Vivian as, someone had deliberately overridden the unit's automatic fault detection to prevent it from triggering an alarm. The manipulation was recent and had been done with knowledge of the system's architecture. 6 minutes, Vivian thought. It had taken Tennant 6 minutes to turn off the system that was supposed to catch what he'd created. The OSHA report also flagged 2 additional facilities in the Hargrove network for priority inspection based on the vendor contract analysis. The same ghost vendors had contracts at both locations. She read that part twice and thought about what it meant, about how many people might have been working in spaces where safety systems were being managed by people who were being paid not to find problems rather than to fix them. She called Nolan that evening. OSHA confirmed the unit was deliberately interfered with, she said. A pause. I know, he said. Sheila told me. Does that... She stopped herself. Does that what? I was going to ask if that changes anything for you, but I think I already know the answer. It confirms what the 6-minute gap in the footage already suggested, he said. His voice was even, but she'd gotten better at hearing what was under the evenness. It means it wasn't just fraud. He put those people at risk intentionally to cover a financial operation. And then when someone found it, he stopped. Yeah, it changes things. Not in terms of what I'm going to do, but in terms of what it is. I'm sorry, she said. She wasn't sure exactly what she was apologizing for. Maybe for the whole situation, for the company she ran being the container in which this had happened. You didn't do it, he said. I sat in a room and let you get fired. You fixed it, he said. Simply, without absolution or condemnation. Just the fact of it. She didn't know what to do with that. She said, "How's Lily?" A brief pause. She'd surprised him with the question. She's good. She's been on a thing about suspension bridges for 3 weeks. She explained cable tension to her teacher, apparently. Despite everything, Vivian laughed. It came out a little rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while. That's remarkable. She's remarkable, he said. Not with the performed pride of someone performing parenthood, but with the flat certainty of someone stating a known fact. She doesn't know the half of what's been going on. I'd like to keep it that way. Of course. When does the FBI interview happen? Monday. I go in at 10. Okay. A pause. You'll be fine. She hadn't expected him to say that. You don't know that. No, he said, but you've handled everything else. You'll handle this. After they hung up, she stood in her kitchen for a moment, in the specific stillness of a person who'd just been steadied by someone who had less reason than anyone to be doing the steadying. She thought about what it meant that a man she'd watched be fired 3 weeks ago was, without apparent effort, the calmest person in her orbit right now. She went to bed earlier than she had in a week. She slept for 6 hours straight, which was more than she'd managed in longer than she could clearly remember. The FBI interview on Monday lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. 2 agents, a conference room in a federal building downtown, a recorder on the table, Sheila Torres sitting beside her. The questions were methodical and thorough and occasionally circled back to things she'd already answered from a slightly different angle, which she understood was technique and which she found uncomfortable anyway because she was, by nature, a person who answered questions directly and didn't love the feeling of being tested for consistency. But her answers were consistent because they were true, which was the only thing that made 2 hours and 40 minutes in a federal interview room manageable. They asked about Holt specifically, his role, his tenure, his access to operational systems, his relationship with the facilities management department. They asked about Tenet. They asked about the vendor contracts and how procurement oversight worked at Hargrove and who had signing authority for renewals below the 50,000 threshold, which was how the ghost vendor contracts had been structured. Each individual contract kept just below the level that required her approval. She'd thought about that when Dana had first pointed it out, and she'd felt the specific coldness of understanding that the architecture of the fraud had been designed around her authority rather than in spite of it. She told the agents that. She told them she thought the threshold had been deliberately exploited. They wrote it down without expression, which was their job, and she respected it. At the end, one of the agents, a woman in her 40s named Reyes, who had done most of the talking, said, "Ms. Hale, you came to us before you were required to. That matters. I want you to know that." "I came to you because 12 people could have been seriously hurt," Vivian said. "And because a man who prevented that got fired for it." Agent Reyes nodded. "We'll be in touch through your counsel." Derek Holt was arrested on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after Nolan had walked out of the conference room. He was taken from the Hargrove offices at 9:40 a.m. by 2 federal agents, which Vivian had been told would happen, but that was still, when it happened, a different thing from being told it would. She was in her office when Marcus came in with the expression of someone who had just seen something he hadn't been entirely prepared to see, and said, quietly, "It's happening." She nodded. She stayed at her desk. She heard the activity from the floor outside. Not chaos, more like the particular quality of silence that a space developed when everyone in it suddenly understood that something significant was occurring and was processing whether to look or pretend not to. She didn't go to the window. She'd asked Sheila what to do when the moment came, and Sheila had said, "Stay where you are. Be available to your employees. Let the process do what the process is designed to do." Gary Tennant was taken from his home at approximately the same time. Coordinated, she'd been told, so that neither had the opportunity to contact the other. She learned the specific charges later that day through Sheila: financial fraud, evidence destruction, witness intimidation for the threatening letter, and for Tennant specifically, the deliberate interference with a workplace safety system, a federal violation that carried its own distinct weight under OSHA criminal provisions. The witness intimidation charge was the one that had required the most additional work, but the threatening letter, combined with Nolan's police report and the forensics tracing the printer used to produce it, a printer registered to a business address connected to one of the shell vendors, had given investigators what they needed. She sat with the charge list for a long time. Witness intimidation. Someone had written out Lily Mercer's bus schedule on a piece of paper and mailed it to her father's home address, and called it a message. And it had worked for about 48 hours before the wrong person decided they weren't going to let it work anymore. She thought about that a lot over the following days. The OSHA inspectors returned to the 2 additional facilities the following week. The violations they documented there were serious, but did not include the deliberate interference found at Facility B. What they found was the more ordinary corruption of safety work being signed off without being done, systems being logged as compliant without being inspected. Serious enough. Carried its own legal exposure for the ghost vendors and for the individuals who'd signed off on the paperwork. Vivienne spent 3 days with her legal team and her communications director working through how to handle the public disclosure. She wanted to be the one to tell it, not to manage the story, but because she'd been the person at the center of it, and it seemed wrong to issue a press release and call it accountability without standing behind it in person. The statement she gave was short. She'd written the first version herself and then worked through 4 drafts with counsel, but the core of it stayed the same from first to last. She acknowledged that serious safety violations and financial fraud had occurred at Hargrove Logistics under her watch. She acknowledged that an employee had been wrongfully terminated after taking action to protect 12 workers from a hazardous exposure event, and that this termination had been engineered by individuals within the company who sought to protect their fraudulent scheme. She committed to a full third-party safety audit of all Hargrove facilities, to structural changes in procurement and safety compliance oversight, and to making whole the employee who had been wrongfully dismissed. She said his name. She'd debated this with counsel, who'd suggested keeping the statement general for liability reasons, and she'd said no. His name was going in because he'd had to carry this without his name, meaning anything, for 5 weeks, and that was ending today. Nolan Mercer, she said, at a small press availability that she'd kept as stripped down as possible. No staging, no backdrop, just a lectern and a handful of reporters, and a statement she read from paper because she wanted to be precise. A maintenance technician who has worked for this company for 4 years identified a dangerous ammonia exposure risk on October 14th and took immediate action to protect the workers in his care. He was subsequently fired by individuals acting to conceal their own wrongdoing. That termination was wrong. What he did was right. The record reflects both of those things, and this company reflects both of those things, starting today. She fielded 4 questions. She answered them as directly as she could without crossing into territory her counsel had outlined. She thanked the reporters for coming and went back inside. Marcus was waiting in the corridor with a bottle of water and the expression of someone who had worked for her for 8 months and was, for the first time, seeing a version of her that he hadn't been certain existed until now. He handed her the water without comment, which was exactly right. "Board call in an hour," he said. "I know. They want to discuss the third-party audit scope." "I know that too." She cracked open the water. "Tell them I'll be on time." She called Nolan that evening. He answered quickly. She'd learned over the past few weeks that he answered quickly when it was her, which she'd noted without examining too closely. "I saw the statement," he said. "I meant what I said. I know." "How are you doing with all of it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was sometimes quiet, not absent, just processing. My sister cried, he said, which I've seen maybe twice in my life. She called me at noon and cried for about 90 seconds, and then told me I should eat something because I probably hadn't, which was accurate. Vivienne laughed again, the same rough-edged laugh she'd had when he'd mentioned Lily and the bridges. Had you? I had some coffee. That's not food. I know that. A pause. She could hear the familiar background sounds of his apartment, small movements, the distant sound of the city. Lily wanted to watch something on TV tonight. I let her stay up past her bedtime. She doesn't know why I'm in a good mood. She just knows I am. Is that what this is? A good mood? Something like it, he said. It's more like the weight shifted, not gone, just moved. She understood that. She'd felt it when Sheila had texted submitted on Monday morning, and again when Reyes had said that matters at the end of the interview, and again today when she'd stood at the lectern and said his name out loud. The weight didn't disappear, but the direction of it changed. There are things we need to talk about, she said, practical things. Your employment status, what the company owes you, next steps. I know. Not tonight. No, he agreed. Not tonight. She leaned against the window of her apartment, her own apartment, which she was in for the first time before 9 p.m. in longer than she could remember. The city outside was doing what cities did, indifferent and continuous, lights in 1,000 windows, people moving through their evenings with their own weights and their own small moments of relief and complication. Nolan. She said his name without thinking about it again, the same way she had in the business center that night. For what it's worth, I'm glad you left without saying anything in that conference room. A pause. Why? Because if you'd talked, Holt would have known exactly what you had. He would have had time to move things, cover more ground. Your silence was the one thing he couldn't prepare for. A short silence on his end. I didn't leave without saying anything because I had a strategy, he said. I left because I looked at the people in that room, and I realized that anything I said was going to be used against me. And I was tired. I was tired, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. She thought about that. About the gap between the story she'd built around his silence, the careful, tactical silence of a man protecting his position, and the actual reason, which was simpler and more human, and somehow more affecting than the version she'd constructed. Well, she said, it worked anyway. Yeah, he said. I guess it did. The call ended a few minutes later, without drama, the way their conversations had started to end. Not abruptly, but naturally, the way conversations ended between people who had run out of the necessary things and were leaving room for the next time. She put her phone down on the windowsill and looked at the city and thought about the long series of things that had to happen in exactly the order they happened for any of it to have turned out this way. The secondary camera that no one had thought to look for, the metadata that the person deleting the records hadn't known to clean up, Marcus's brother in IT forensics, Dana's 2 names, Sheila's 40-page summary, and before all of it, a maintenance technician doing a routine check at 11:26 p.m., who had a meter in his hand and a habit of looking at what the numbers actually said. She thought about that for a long time. Then she went and made herself something to eat because it was past 8 and she hadn't had anything since lunch, and because whatever came next, she was going to need to be in better shape than she'd been for the past 5 weeks. The city kept moving outside her window, indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware that somewhere in it, in an apartment with a water stain above the closet and a child's drawing on the refrigerator, a man who had done the right thing was finally, after 5 weeks of carrying it alone, letting himself breathe. The back pay arrived in Nolan's account on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before Thanksgiving. He was standing in the kitchen when his phone buzzed with the notification, still in the gray half-light of 6 a.m., the coffee not yet finished, Lily still asleep. He looked at the number on the screen for a moment without reacting, the way he'd learned to look at numbers. Meter readings, repair estimates, damage reports, without letting his first response be his final one. Then he set the phone face down on the counter and finished making the coffee and stood at the window and watched the street below come awake. And he let himself feel what he felt, which was not triumph, not relief exactly, but something closer to the particular tiredness that came after a long physical job. Not bad tiredness, just the body's honest accounting of what it had spent. 6 weeks of back pay, his unused vacation, a formal settlement sum that Sheila had negotiated with Hargrove's outside counsel over 2 sessions that Nolan had not attended, because he'd told Sheila what he needed and trusted her to get it, and she had. He wasn't rich. He hadn't been made whole in any way that erased what the past 6 weeks had cost. The lost sleep, the specific fear that came from a letter with his daughter's schedule on it, the weeks of job searching that had produced nothing because his reference from Hargrove was, until the public statement, essentially a black mark. None of that got paid out in a settlement, but the number was enough to breathe for a while, enough to stop watching his bank account with the hypervigilance of a man who knows the margin is thin. He turned the phone back over and looked at it again. Then he poured his coffee and went to wake his daughter. Yishbab. Thanksgiving that year was at Renata's. Nolan drove down to Baltimore on Wednesday afternoon with Lily in the back seat, asking questions about highway engineering for the first 45 minutes, and then falling asleep with her cheek against the window. And he drove in the specific quiet of a car with a sleeping child and let the miles go by and tried to figure out what he was feeling. What he was feeling was complicated in the way that things were complicated when you'd been focused on a problem for so long that its resolution left you briefly without an organizing principle. The problem had been survive the termination, protect what he knew, not let Lily be frightened, not let the people who'd done this get away with it. He'd lived inside that problem for 6 weeks. Now the problem was resolved, not cleanly, not without remainder, but resolved. And he was driving through November, Maryland with his daughter asleep in the back seat, and he didn't quite know where to put his attention now that it didn't have somewhere it had to be. Renata's house smelled like sweet potato and garlic when they arrived, which was what it always smelled like on Thanksgiving because Renata cooked the way she did everything else, thoroughly, with a plan, starting a day ahead. Lily woke up when the car stopped and was immediately and completely alert, which was still one of Nolan's favorite things about her, and she ran to the door before he'd gotten the bag out of the trunk. Dinner was 6 people. Renata, her husband Terrence, their 2 boys who were 11 and 14, and found Lily both annoying and entertaining in equal measure, and Nolan. They ate too much and the boys argued about something sports-related, and Lily told Terrence about suspension bridges, until he declared with genuine admiration that she was the most interesting 7-year-old he'd ever met, and Lily accepted this with the composure of someone who had already arrived at that conclusion independently. After dinner, after the kids were in front of the TV, Renata and Nolan sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of the meal and the particular quietness of 2 people who had a lot to say and weren't sure where to start. "So," Renata said. "So," he said, "how are you actually doing?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He turned his coffee mug in his hands, the same gesture she knew that he'd been doing since he was about 15 years old whenever he was working something out. "I'm strange," he said finally. "That's closer to it. Like something that was holding a lot of tension just released. And now I don't know what my posture is supposed to be. That's called relief. It doesn't feel like I thought it would." "It never does." Renata leaned back in her chair. "You thought you'd feel good." "I thought I'd feel done." "You are done." "I know, but done and feeling done are different things. The 12 people who were on that shift, I don't know any of them. I don't know what they know about what almost happened. I don't know if anyone told them." He paused. "That bothers me." "Does it need to not bother you to be okay?" He thought about that. "No," he said. "I guess not." "It should bother you," she said, not unkindly. "It means you're paying attention to the right things." He went back to work at Hargrove on December 3rd. Not to the maintenance floor, though that had been offered. A full reinstatement at his prior level, with back pay and a written apology from the board that was formal and correct and carried the specific temperature of something a legal team had approved. He read the apology once and put it in the same accordion folder as everything else, and didn't take it out again. What he went back to was different. The conversation with Vivian had happened in stages. First, a formal meeting with Sheila present, which was about the settlement and the employment terms, and then a second conversation that was shorter and less formal, and that Vivian had asked for specifically, just the 2 of them, in the same business center meeting room where she'd watched the security footage for the first time. "I want to offer you something," she'd said, and I want to do it in person rather than through lawyers, because I think that's the way it should be done. He'd been prepared for a title, a salary number, the standard vocabulary of corporate rehabilitation, the kind of offer that was partly genuine and partly optics, the company making visible amends through a visible gesture. What she offered him was more specific than that. "I'm creating a position," she said, "head of safety and compliance, reporting directly to me, not to operations, not to facilities management. To me. The job is to look at every facility we have and tell me the truth about what's actually happening in them, and to build a system where the truth gets told consistently whether or not it's convenient." She paused. "I want someone who has demonstrated, under actual pressure, that they will tell the truth when it costs them something. I don't know another way to find that person." He'd sat with that for a moment. "You're describing a job where I'd be responsible for finding the next Gary Tennant before he becomes the next Gary Tennant." "Yes." "Which means the job requires people to be uncomfortable around me." "Some people. The ones who should be." "And I'd report to you." "Directly." "Which means if you and I ever disagreed about what the truth was, I'd be in the same position I was in before." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, except that this time you'd be in the position before a crisis, not during one, and you'd have authority, a budget, and a direct line to me and to the board." She paused. "I'm not offering you a guarantee that it would always go well. I'm offering you a structure that's better than the one that failed you." He thought about it for a long time. He thought about the 12 workers he didn't know. He thought about the 2 additional facilities OSHA had flagged and the violations they'd found there, and the fact that without the October 14th incident coming to light, those facilities would have gone on being what they were indefinitely. He thought about the specific problem with corruption in systems, not just that it was wrong, but that it was self-protecting, that it created the conditions for its own survival by removing the people most likely to see it clearly. He thought about whether he was the right person for this. He didn't arrive at yes because he was certain. He arrived at yes because the alternative was leaving the problem to someone else, and he'd spent enough time around systems to know that problems left to someone else usually stayed problems. "I need one thing," he said. "Tell me. If I bring you something and it involves people you're close to, professionally, personally, whatever, I need your word that the process doesn't change, that the relationship doesn't change how the problem gets handled." She didn't answer immediately, which he respected. She thought about it. "I can't guarantee I'll always be comfortable with that," she said, "but I can guarantee that I'll hold to it anyway. That's all I can honestly promise." "That's enough," he said. They shook hands. It felt less like a corporate formality and more like 2 people who had been through something together deciding to go through the next thing together as well, which wasn't nothing. He started on December 3rd and spent the first 2 weeks doing exactly what she'd hired him to do, going through every facility in the Hargrove network with the forensic patience of a man who had learned the hard way what it looked like when a system was pretending to function. He was methodical and he was thorough and he knew this about himself, not easy to work with in the early days because he asked questions that people weren't used to being asked, and he waited for actual answers rather than procedural ones. The facilities manager at the Western Distribution Center, a man named Phil, who'd been at Hargrove for 9 years and had the slightly defensive energy of someone who'd never had his work examined this closely before, told him in their first meeting that the safety logs were all in order, with the confident finality of a man closing a door. Nolan said, "I'd like to look at them anyway." Phil looked at him for a moment with an expression that was working through several things. "They're all in order," he said again. "I'm sure they are," Nolan said. "I'd still like to look." It took 3 days to get through the Western facilities logs, and what he found was not fraud. Phil's logs were genuinely in order, mostly, with 2 procedural gaps that were sloppiness rather than intent. But finding that out required looking, and that was the point. He documented the gaps, flagged them to Phil and to Vivian, and moved on to the next facility without drama. Phil sent him an email a week later that said, "The gaps you flagged have been corrected. For what it's worth, nobody's looked that closely at my records in 9 years. I'd prefer if they did more often." Nolan forwarded it to Vivian without comment. She responded, "This is exactly what I hired you for." Lily started calling the Hargrove building Dad's big job, which was how she distinguished it from the work he'd done before, the fixing job. And Nolan had decided not to correct the terminology because it was accurate in ways that mattered to a 7-year-old. He went to a big building. He had a desk, which was new. People came to talk to him, and he gave them answers. That was the visible shape of it. The invisible shape of it was harder to explain and not something he tried to explain to a 7-year-old, but it was something he thought about often in those first months. The specific difficulty of doing the job he'd been hired to do in a culture that had, for years, rewarded the appearance of safety over its substance. You couldn't fix that by installing better logging systems, though you needed better logging systems. You couldn't fix it by creating reporting structures, though you needed those too. What you needed was people to believe that telling the truth about a problem wouldn't destroy them, and building that belief in an organization where the opposite had been demonstrably true for years was slower than any system fix and less measurable and impossible to declare done. He had a meeting every 2 weeks with Vivian, formal, scheduled, in her office or in a conference room, never the kind of meeting where either of them was performing for the other, and never the kind where he held things back, which was the difference between having a reporting relationship and actually using it. She asked hard questions. She sometimes pushed back on his conclusions. He held his position when he was sure and revised when she showed him something he'd missed, which happened 3 times in the first 2 months, and which he noted without embarrassment because being correctable was part of the job. What developed between them in those months was not easy to name, and neither of them tried to name it. It was something that had started in a conference room where they'd been on opposite sides of a table and had moved through a diner booth in a business center parking lot and a phone call at 9 in the evening where he'd told her she'd be fine and she'd said, "You don't know that," and he'd said, "No, but you've handled everything else." It was built out of the specific material of having been through something together that required honesty under pressure. And that kind of material made something durable even when you weren't trying to make something at all. In March, she asked him to join a board presentation on the new compliance framework. Not to sit in the back of the room, to present. To stand in front of the board of directors and explain what he'd found in his first 3 months and what he recommended going forward. He'd been in maintenance for 4 years. He'd never presented to a board in his life. "I'm not a presenter," he told her. "You're a person who explains things clearly under pressure," she said. "That's what a presentation is." Those are different skill sets. They overlap more than you think. He presented to the board on a Thursday morning in March, in a room that was significantly more intimidating than the conference room where he'd been fired, with 16 board members and Vivian at the head of the table and a slide deck Marcus had helped him build. He was not smooth. He stumbled on one slide and had to back up and re-explain. He answered 2 questions from board members who were clearly skeptical of the structural changes he was recommending in a way that was direct but not defensive. And he thought afterward that direct but not defensive was the best he could have done in that room. Vivian texted him that evening, "You were good in there." He responded, "I stumbled on the 3rd slide." She wrote back, "Everyone saw that you knew what you were talking about anyway. That's the thing that mattered." He put his phone down and looked at his apartment. The water stain above the closet, the radiator making its opinions known, the sunflower magnet on the refrigerator holding Lily's drawing of the man with the wrench. He'd been meaning to replace the fluorescent tube in the kitchen since October. He'd kept forgetting. He got up, found the tube he'd finally bought 2 weeks ago, and left on top of the refrigerator, got the stepladder from the closet, and replaced it. The kitchen flooded with clean white light. Small thing, but he was tired of the buzzing. But the trial dates were set for late spring. Derek Holt had entered a not guilty plea, which Sheila had told Nolan to expect. Most people in Holt's position did, she said, because the calculus of a trial was different from the calculus of guilt, and Holt had the money for defense counsel that could complicate even a strong evidentiary case. Gary Tennant had taken a different path. 6 weeks after his arrest, he'd entered a plea agreement, cooperation in exchange for reduced charges, which meant his testimony against Holt would be part of the prosecution's case. Nolan had gotten this news from Sheila on a Monday morning and had sat with it for a while without knowing exactly how to feel. Tennant was the person who'd been in that corridor. Tennant was the person who'd disabled the fault detection system, who'd texted Nolan on his personal phone, who'd signed off on fake repair work for 2 years. The idea of him getting a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony was not wrong exactly. That was how prosecutions worked. But it sat uneasy in a way that Nolan acknowledged to himself without expecting it to resolve neatly. He mentioned it to Vivian at their next bi-weekly meeting, not as a complaint, just as a thing he was carrying. "Does it change anything for you?" she asked. "No," he said. It's not clean. It was never going to be clean." "I know." "The 12 workers are safe. The facilities are being actually inspected now. The fraud is being prosecuted. Tenet's cooperation makes the Holt prosecution stronger." She paused. "The mess in the middle of that is real, but so is the result." "I know," he said again. "I'm not arguing with the result. I'm just noting that the middle is messy." She looked at him with an expression he'd gotten used to over the months, something between respect and what he thought might have been, though he hadn't allowed himself to examine it too closely, something warmer than professional regard. "You're going to have a hard time in this job if you expect clean outcomes," she said. "I've never expected clean outcomes. I'm a maintenance technician. Clean outcomes don't exist in maintenance." "No," she said, "but you fix things anyway." He thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's the job." The thing about fixing things was that it required you to look clearly at what was broken, and looking clearly at what was broken meant accepting that broken was the default state of most systems, not as a failure, just as a fact of how things were. Systems degraded. Seals failed. People found ways to root around inconvenient truths when those truths cost them something. This was not a counsel of despair. It was just what was true. And what was true was always a better starting point than what was comfortable. Nolan had understood this about mechanical systems for years. He was slowly learning to understand it about people. The thing people got wrong about corruption, about the Derek Holts of the world, was that they imagined it as an exceptional thing, a deviation from a norm that otherwise held. In Nolan's experience, from 4 years of working in the guts of organizations, the norm was much more fragile than that. The norm was maintained by the accumulation of small decisions made by individual people in individual moments. The decision to look at the number on the meter and take it seriously, the decision to ask the next question instead of accepting the packaged answer, the decision to say, "No, I'm not comfortable with this," even when saying that had a cost. Most people, most of the time, wanted to make those decisions. They wanted to be the kind of person who didn't look away. What they needed was a structure that made looking away harder than looking clearly, and a culture that didn't punish the looking. That was what he was trying to build. Not perfectly. He didn't have a vocabulary for perfect anymore, if he'd ever had one, but consistently. Day after day, facility by facility, question by question, in a company that was slowly learning what it looked like when the person responsible for safety was someone who actually meant it. In April, one of the workers from the October 14th shift found him. Her name was Carmen, and she'd gotten his contact information from the union rep who'd been involved in the post-incident review. She sent him an email that was 3 sentences long. "I was working the night you shut down the wing. I found out recently what was actually in the air that night. I wanted to say thank you." He read it twice. He thought about what to write back and started 2 responses and deleted both of them because they sounded like things you said when you were trying to say the right thing rather than the true thing. He wrote, "I'm glad everyone got home that night. That's what mattered." She wrote back, "It mattered that someone was paying attention. Not everyone does." He saved that email, not in a folder, not formally, just moved it to a subfolder in his personal account where he kept things he wanted to be able to find again. He wasn't sure why it mattered as much as it did. He'd done the math on October 14th hundreds of times by now. He knew what the numbers said. But there was a difference between knowing abstractly that something had happened and having a person who'd been in that space, breathing that air, say thank you. The specific, irreducible weight of an actual human being on the other side of a decision. He thought about what Lily had said that night at the kitchen table, eating pasta. It's their fault, the certainty of it. The clean moral logic of a 7-year-old who believed that doing the right thing meant something. He wanted her to keep believing that. He understood it wasn't quite that simple, but he also understood, had always understood if he was honest, that simple and true weren't the same thing, and that some things could be both at once. Doing the right thing did mean something. It meant something even when it cost you. It meant something especially when it cost you, because that was when the meaning was tested, and what got tested and held was worth something that untested things weren't. He wasn't good at talking about things like this. He was better with systems, with the physical logic of cause and effect. But he thought about it sometimes, especially in the quiet parts of the day, early morning before Lily woke up, or late at night after she was asleep, and he'd developed a rough private vocabulary for it that he didn't share with many people. He shared parts of it, occasionally, with Vivian. The evening in May that changed things between them didn't announce itself as significant. It was a Wednesday, late, after a day that had run long for both of them. A compliance review meeting that had turned complicated when one of the facility managers pushed back on the new inspection protocols more aggressively than anticipated, and a budget conversation that had required more of Vivian's patience than she'd had to spare. They ended up in the same corridor outside the conference room at the same time, and she said she was going to get food because she hadn't eaten since noon, and he said he hadn't either, and it was a statement of fact that became, without much discussion, the two of them eating at a small Italian place 2 blocks from the office. It was different from the diner in January. That had been purposeful. 2 people with something to establish, sitting across from each other with evidence and questions between them. This was just dinner. They talked about the facility manager's pushback and whether it was territorial defensiveness or genuine operational concern, which led to a longer conversation about how you distinguished between the two, which led to something Vivian said about the early months of her tenure that was more candid than anything she'd said in a professional context. I kept accepting the packaged answers, she said. She had a glass of wine. She wasn't drinking it quickly, just holding it. I told myself it was because I was new and still learning the system. But some of it was just, it was easier. The packaged answers were good answers. They had documentation. She paused. I don't think I was negligent, but I wasn't curious enough. And not being curious enough in that role is its own kind of failure. You became curious, he said, because of what happened to you. You would have found something eventually. Maybe, but eventually isn't the same as in time. She turned the wine glass. I've thought about that a lot. What it means that it took something going this wrong before I asked the questions I should have been asking anyway. He thought about what to say. He thought about the easy answer, the one that let her off the hook, that put the failure cleanly on Holt and Tennant and removed it from her. He didn't say it. It means you learned something expensive, he said, and that the question is whether it changes what you do next, which it has. So, he shrugged. That's what it means. She looked at him for a moment. You don't give easy answers. You didn't hire me to give easy answers. I didn't hire you for dinners either, she said, and the slight smile that came with it was the least managed expression he'd ever seen on her face. Not performed, just there, honest in the way that people were honest when they forgot for a moment to be careful. No, he said. This is separate. Yes, she said. It is. They didn't name it that evening. They didn't need to. It was enough that it had been acknowledged, that the line between the professional thing and the other thing had been noted by both of them, and neither of them had immediately erected a wall around it. They were both careful people by nature and circumstance, both shaped by experiences that had made them slow to trust. And what was developing between them was appropriately slow for what it was, something real, moving at the speed of things that were actually built rather than assembled. He drove home and got there at 10:30 and found Lily asleep exactly where she was supposed to be, and Mrs., parked from downstairs, who had become an informal but essential part of his life over the past months, the kind of neighbor that cities occasionally produced who was simply available in the way that people used to be more available to each other, had left a note on the counter saying everything had been fine and Lily had eaten her dinner and only pushed back on bedtime once. He stood in the kitchen in the quiet apartment and thought about the arc of the past 7 months. October, the conference room. November, the letter. The diner in January, the business center, the footage, the submission, the arrest. The statement where she'd said his name, Carmen's 3-sentence email. The board presentation and the stumbled slide. The bi-weekly meetings. The slow, patient work of building something that was supposed to hold. And now dinner. And a smile that was honest because she'd forgotten to manage it, and two people who'd been through something together that most people never went through, deciding, carefully and without rushing, to see what else they might be capable of building. It wasn't a clean story. Nothing real was. It had a threatening letter in the middle of it, and a deleted database, and two shell companies, and a man who'd spent 6 weeks carrying something that should never have been his to carry alone. It had a woman who'd sat in a conference room and not asked the right questions fast enough, and then spent every hour after that trying to make that right. It had a 7-year-old who'd explained cable tension to her teacher and gone to sleep not knowing how close the world had come to her father being defined by what he'd lost rather than what he'd refused to lose. The stories worth telling rarely had clean arcs. They had the arcs of people, jagged, interrupted, circling back, finding their way to something that resembled resolution only in retrospect. You didn't know you'd gotten through the hardest part until you were on the other side of it, and even then what you felt wasn't triumph. What you felt was the specific tiredness of effort genuinely spent, and the specific satisfaction of a thing that had been looked at honestly and handled correctly, and the quiet, durable knowledge that when it had mattered, when the number on the meter had told you something you didn't want it to tell you, you had not looked away. Nolan turned off the kitchen light, the new one, the one that didn't buzz, and went to bed. The apartment was quiet. The city outside was doing what it always did. And somewhere across town, a woman who had started from the wrong place and found her way to the right one was probably still awake, because that was who she was. Going through whatever came next with the same uncomfortable honesty she'd brought to everything since a maintenance technician had walked out of a conference room without saying a word and made her want to understand why. Neither of them had arrived where they were by taking the easy path. That was maybe the most honest thing you could say about both of them. They hadn't taken the easy path, and the path they'd taken had led here. To a job that mattered, to a company that was learning to tell the truth about itself, to a 7-year-old who believed that doing the right thing meant something, and to two imperfect people moving carefully toward each other in the way that people did when they'd both had enough experience with things falling apart to understand what it took to build something that held. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a true one, and true was always worth more.